undermine one's narrative. Now, from the 1970s, since Professor Ashford mentioned John Rawls, you remember, Nicholas, what happened after the publication of the Theory of Justice in '71. We had another publication 3 years later by Robert Nozick, which effectively annulled everything that Rawls succeeded in putting on the table. The point here is very simple. Yes, and it's a very bad book. It's called Political Liberalism. But let's not, let me be brief. If we pin our colors on the mast of justice, the opposition is going to turn to a different concept, such as rationality, such as efficiency. And every time, at least judging from the past 20 years or so, justice has been pitted against efficiency and rationality. Justice has lost out, and it has been shown to be an ill-defined concept. Now, the problem, we can go on into a discussion about Rawls, but my assessment is that Nozick wiped the floor clean with Rawls for illegitimate reasons, but nevertheless succeeded in doing so. And the simple point I'm making here is this. If we really want a greening humanity agenda to be promoted, perhaps talking about justice is an own goal. The point here is that this project requires a narrative founded on principles of reasoning, of rationality, and finally, of liberty.
Much. I'd love to answer that question myself, but I won't. There's a gentleman at the back. Yes, please. Don't forget to give your name and... I'll
give my name. I don't have a microphone in reach. So we can hear you quite well at the moment. Keep your voice up. I'm John Cogan. We need a microphone. Παρακαλώ, χρησιμοποιήστε το μικρόφωνο. Please. Here we go. Thank you. To record your voice for posterity.
Excellent. I'm John Cogan from the University of Manchester. Firstly, I don't think it's quite fair to say that Nozick annulled Rawls' argument just because I think Nozick's argument in Anarchy, State and Utopia was pretty poor, and it started with a fairly grandiose claim that required substantiation, and instead of substantiating it, just told us what follows from that. So I don't think it's a careful conceptual or analytic work. It might have had the effect. It might be used by people to say something, but I don't think it's a piece of equal scholarship. Particularly prompted by Professor Ashford, but generally I'd be interested in the panel's views on the role of democracy here. Professor Ashford, you voiced some skepticism of the way that democratic mechanisms are used by governments, and I share that skepticism, but what I wonder about is if we know what's right or good, and we're settled on the outcomes and want to achieve it, then are we any less cynical in trying to manipulate democratic mechanisms so that people make the right choice? And what quite are we doing by asking the people what they think if first we're to educate them, to tell them what to think, so that then they can give their mandate to some action that we already think is right, and furthermore, if they disagreed, we'd think they were wrong, and we ought to re-educate them. And you see that in referenda, for example, you know, the Irish referenda on the EU constitution, or a treaty. Every time it comes round, you just wait till you get the right answer. And I wonder if we're any less cynical, if we have an agenda that says environmental justice is key. If we have an agenda that says environmental justice is what we need to achieve, quite what role democracy has to play in that.
Thank you very much. It's great to have somebody from the new generation at the University of Manchester, if I may say so. Right, Professor Avgouleias.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Many thanks to the panel for excellent presentations. Congratulations all. I'd like to focus on the roles in EC2. Nicholas, I thought that was an excellent idea. The problem is, of course, how do you define it? I think the way this conference is progressing these 2 days is we go from the Varoufakis presentation, where the global commons are described, are delineated, to your idea how they should be protected. And I happen to think that the Rawls is an excellent, the Rawls and theory of justice is an excellent framework to address the issues at the policy level, because they also, the Rawls and theory of justice also addresses issues of intergenerational and intergenerational justice, which Dr. Karagiorgou and I think Linda Nielsen raised as well. But the point is, and I think I do have an idea, but I need a break to elaborate on that. How do you make that legally binding so that Professor Christie's courts enforce it?
Thank you very much. Yes, the lady there in the multi-faceted dress.
I just wanted to pick up on the point of, I'm so sorry, I never caught your name. As a political philosopher, I must admit, most of the people I know find Nozick fascinating, but don't feel that he wiped the floor of rules. But it does seem to me that his point is a really serious one, which is that you do have to think strategically, and then the question is, how are the concepts we want going to be used by opponents? And that seems to be incredibly important, and perhaps points to one issue that we haven't talked about directly, but we've skirted, and that does seem relevant to questions of justice, which is, what sort of claims to profit are we going to allow companies? Because in a way, it's fine to call them special interests, but the fact is we rely on them in various ways. Most of us believe that people are entitled to various forms of profit from their activities, even companies, even very large ones. But without discussing that in a way, the perimeters of what we think are the appropriate grounds for profit, it does seem to me we have a very large hole that leaves us vulnerable to exactly the sorts of problems he was talking about, that makes it very hard, actually, to think strategically about something we really need to take preemptive action on. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yes, thank you. Recognizing really that unless, under our present arrangements, unless people carry on business and make a profit, then it will be impossible to solve environmental problems, however damaging that can at times be. Right, I'm going to give you the last word before we come back to the panel, so bear with me for 1 second. Can we have a couple more comments from the floor before we turn to our host and then back to the panel? Anybody else? Now's your chance. No? Okay, over to you.
As Socrates said, I know one thing that I know nothing. So it was a very enlightening conference, and I realized that in reality, no is a strong word. I understand less than I thought I understood. Therefore, my simple question is the following, and I was very deeply influenced by Professor Nielsen's presentation, because we have to go from the ethics to the law, bioethics, biolaw. We have to go, if we're living in a perfect society, people who should be in a position to adhere and be self-regulated. In a totally authoritarian, we have to be 100% 1, 2, 3, 4. The most important thing, and I was also impressed by Professor Varoufakis' very interesting, challenging presentation. And one thing I understood yesterday very clearly is the following, that it is very important to know what we're talking about. So the most important thing is awareness. The most dangerous thing is to regulate in an expedient way, and then to regulate in a wrongful way, and then we can undermine the substance of this very important process for humanity. So my question to the audience is the following. Is it up to the society and up to the stakeholders, being academians, being politicians, first of all, to create the awareness, and therefore in a global way, because environment is not regional, it's something that's affecting all of us, to set out the basis on which we can start building up legislation in a convincing way. Because even NGOs, sorry to say, although we are in a way an NGO, our foundation, but in many instances, you have very strong interest behind NGOs, so everything is not a panacea. We have to be very careful in order to keep the proper checks and balances. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to come back to give each of them 2 or 3 minutes to make some concluding remarks. And I'm going to go in reverse order, I think, or along the table, starting at the far end, which I think means Lisbeth goes first. So I'll give you a moment or two to collect your thoughts. And my very respectful advice to the panel is that if we are to have our lunch soon, which many of us would like to do, identify the most interesting question that was asked that you want to address and deal with that. So it's the first lesson that we teach students of advocacy. Pick your best point and go for that. So, Lisbeth, if you don't wish to contribute, of course you don't have to. But Lisbeth, if you would like to have your 2 or 3 minutes, then perhaps you'd be kind enough to start. We're so grateful that you came here all the way from Singapore.
I'll do it short. I think there's one thing that came to my mind through all the questions and also through all the presentations, and that also in Professor Harris's first question about what counts as the environment, and then the question was raised what the role of democracy is here, and I'm thinking how to involve the public and how to promote awareness. I think one thing is that we all talk about sustainability, but we haven't really addressed the fact that we might not agree on what a sustainable development is. And in order to even come to some conclusions about how we should proceed from here, we need to have proper public debate and engagement. I know that's almost a cliche because it always comes up, but we really need to address what do we see as a sustainable development, what is sustainability, and there are differences in concerns about environment, definitely. There will be issues about what we perceive as nature, and nature that needs to be protected. And I think it's important to include, I think it was an interesting idea to include nature as a third principle, to add that to Rawls's theory, but we need to discuss what we mean by nature and the environment in this context. Thank you
very much. Nicholas.
Well, you know, I'd rather talk than eat. These are very serious questions, and I think they deserve more than 2 minutes, and I think the people who asked them were insightful. I'm going to try to answer as many as I can.
Take 4 minutes.
Pardon me?
Have 4 minutes.
Well, before you cut me off, I'm going to say that you need 3 things. You need to answer all these questions. You need understanding, you need transparency, and you need to protect minority views. I mean, those are the underlying things. Let me deal with one thing at a time. World referenda and social movements from the bottom, I think, are not going to be successful. What you can do, by my diatribe against process alone, I wasn't meaning to say that process isn't important. Process is terribly important. We have the Aarhus Convention, both adopted in the European Union and in international law. What's interesting, it provides access to information and participation in government. What's interesting is that the governments that really resisted the participation in government were the European countries. They don't want to have people after they've decided what they want to do. And so look at the European Union that discourages and allows nations to decide how much participation you can have by court challenges and the like. So you have to put your money where your mouth is. There are all kinds of problems in not allowing adequate participation. Most international organizations are not tripartite, let alone bipartite. The only tripartite organization is the International Labor Organization, and it is being whittled back. The point is that governments that are controlled by the private sector that's been talked about really make these decisions, and they don't make them in the sunshine. When we had the WTO standard on asbestos, first of all, the WTO said, well, let's go to the public interest groups to write a friendly brief about asbestos. And then they said, no, actually, we don't want to hear what you have to say.